Welcome to the Biohacking Superhuman Performance Podcast. My name is Natalie Nidham. I'm a nutritionist, a human potential and epigenetic coach, and I created this podcast to bring you the latest ways to take control of your health and longevity. We cover it all, from new technology to ancestral health practices, personalized interventions, and a very special interest of mine, peptides. Enjoy the show. Welcome to part 2 of the Biostrap series of podcasts. This is the last one. This is the last installment. We released the first one a few days ago, earlier this week, and this is part 2 of that podcast. And the reason why we did this in 2 parts is because we've basically gotten 2 different perspectives from 2 key players at Biostrap to give us their input on how this wearable is different from other wearables, what it can do, and how people can get the most value out of it. So today we're talking to Kevin Longoria. He is the Chief Science Officer at Biostrap, and he is a clinical physiologist who has actually moved from the neuroscience and high performance space into the clinical space, which was really his dream all along. In the last couple of years, he's been working with Biostrap, which he actually found while looking for a wearable that had the data integrity that he needed for his clinical work. So we talk a bit more about the different types of sensors that Biostrap uses in their different devices. And we talk about why wearing Biostrap during the day may or may not be optimal, why that data is not, you can't really trust it as much, and why it's really a nighttime wearable. We get into some of the research, like the clinical studies that Biostrap is currently being used for in universities around the world. And we dig in a little bit more into this new biomarker of arterial elasticity that Kevin believes may actually be a real game changer in preventative healthcare, as it may be an incredibly accurate predictor of cardiovascular health or disease. So, I mean, it's still early days, but we talk about some of the trials and some of the evidence that they've seen around this biomarker. It's really interesting stuff. I'm going to let it go there because those of you who've already listened to part 1 are familiar with Biostrap and some of these concepts. This is part 2, Kevin Longoria, Chief Science Officer. So thank you so much for being here today. If you get value from this podcast, as always, please make sure that you share it out with your networks and your friends. Make sure that you leave us your comments and questions. Either leave a review on iTunes or Spotify or Google Podcasts, wherever you're consuming this podcast, or you can send me a message on my website or through my website, which is natnidham.com. Or you can find me at the Optimizing Superhuman Performance group on Facebook. So make note of that. I've had to change the name of the group. It's Optimizing Superhuman Performance. So a little bit different than the name of the podcast. We still have the Biohacking Superhuman Performance group on MeWe. And so you can find me in both those places. You can obviously leave comments. You can join. These are great communities, very rich, lots of activity going on there, lots of exchanging of information. So I always love meeting people there. And of course, you can also find me on Instagram at Natalie Nidham. And that's about it in terms of finding me. If you are looking to buy a Biostrap, you can go to biostrap.com, and Biostrap has very generously given us a great discount. It's Longevity 10, and that will give you 10% off your Biostrap. And for, full transparency, just so you guys know, that is an affiliate code. And that means that it's by people using these links that I'm able to invest more into this podcast to bring you great content every week. So again, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate you guys. And I hope that you enjoy listening to this episode as much as I enjoyed recording it. Okay, hello and welcome to the show, Kevin Longoria. It's so nice to meet you.
Great to meet you as well, Natalie. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So Kevin, I always like to start by getting to know my guests a bit. So we've just met. So why don't you tell me about yourself? What got you to where you are today? You're with Biostrap, and why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey to get here?
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. So Kevin Longoria, I'm a clinical physiologist. I've spent the last several years working with various different patient populations ranging from severe neuromuscular conditions up to I'm the personal physiologist for a number of world champion athletes. So prior to this, actually where I met Biostrap, I had this amazing laboratory where we'd largely develop and validate nervous system-based models for all of these different populations. And at one point, I kind of hit the wall in terms of understanding my care was very limited within kind of my facility walls. We wanted to extend our care beyond, and so with that, we started to essentially look for the world's best commercial wearable, right? To be able to track sleep and heart rate variability and all of these things longitudinally over time has a lot of value. But historically, from the professional standpoint, we've always been a little hesitant to adopt wearable technology because the data integrity wasn't there.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, I got my hands on every single wearable that you could imagine, ran it through my own internal testing, and really found that Biostrap, was the only one that had the level of data integrity that I needed. I'm an algorithms guy, right? So base of every algorithm, you need really good data to basically build your logic on top of that, and every other wearable I came across fell short. So long story short, I validated the Biostrap, started to build some algorithms on top of it, and then ultimately decided to jump on board as the chief science officer for Biostrap. My previous company took a little bit of an athletic turn, which was great, won a few world championships, very exciting. But I always wanted to live in the clinical side of things, really developing and validating programs more in the preventative landscape and a little bit on the health management side of things as well. So really honored to be part of the Biostrap.
That's amazing. Okay. So how long have you been with Biostrap?
I've been partners with Biostrap for about 2.5 years now. I've officially been on board as the CSO for almost 1 year.
Okay. So you were part of the team really that's brought this new Biostrap EVO to the market, right? Because this is EVO, I'm guessing stands for evolution. So this current model that we're all wearing is the next evolution of the Biostrap. Am I correct in that?
Absolutely. Yeah, the first generation device just had some limitations in general, things like battery life, right? We get compared, put in the bucket of commercial wearables that have 5 to 7 day battery life.
Mm-hmm.
We're not quite there yet, but we wanted to be better than what we were, which was closer to about 1 day. When you really compare what we do, our rate of data collection, it's more comparable to the equipment in a hospital that has to be plugged in all of the time, not necessarily the Apple Watch. Right now, we're somewhere in between, but more like consumer-driven features such as like sync times and things that we really improved as well. So we call this generation 1.5 and constantly developing for the next generation device as well.
Right. Well, and I think it's interesting what you say there, because I think it's lost on a lot of people that the device, the Biostrap, is constantly, and I mean, there's in the settings you can choose, like it can check in with you basically. I think there's a 10-minute option, a 30-minute option, and a daily option. Like the less frequently it checks on your metrics, the longer the battery life is going to be, obviously, but then you're sacrificing something on the back end as well. But what I'm curious about is that it seems to me, both from speaking with Elias last week and doing some of the reading I've done, doing that, it seems that the Biostrap focus is really nighttime. It's really nocturnal metrics. And so can we talk about, I mean, I get the feeling that what you guys did is said, look, to have one thing that does it all, you have to sacrifice something. And so, when you go to the Biostrap website now, there's 3 different devices you can get. One is the shoe pod that is more, it's almost more GPS functionality. There's the heart rate monitor, which is more, heart rate monitor for while you're working out. And then this thing, which really is about nighttime metrics. So can you explain to me a little bit about this? Like, am I right in saying that, and is there any use of wearing it during the day?
Absolutely. So that there are absolute limitations in terms of optimizing data integrity. It's very difficult for one sensor to do everything.
Yeah.
Right. So just the quick rundown of the Biostrap EVO, the nocturnal sensor. We utilize red and infrared photoplethysmography, what we call PPG, to keep it very simple.
Yeah.
There's a lot of advantages to red and infrared PPG. Largely, it's able to penetrate about 10 times deeper. This is why we're able to derive very meaningful health metrics like respiratory rate, oxygen saturation, and some other very unique ones such as arterial and peripheral elasticity. Whereas the green light sensors, which is found in every other commercial device out there, they're not able to penetrate very deeply. So that's why they're getting more crude metrics, right? Beyond that, there are advantages to the green light, such as motion tolerance. So that's why we're so good at focusing on nocturnal with this sensor here, is because motion is very limited.
Right.
Beyond that, when it comes to trendability of data, environmental context really, really matters. So if we're looking at a data set and we see a spike in heart rate, or heart rate variability drops during the day, and we have no context of if you were sitting in traffic, if you were stressed, if you were taking a test.
Right.
When we start building that into machine learning algorithms and such, this represents a major confound because we have no idea what was going on. We really believe sleep is the most important time because as many things as possible are controlled. It's never a perfect situation. But when we go to trend data over time, we're at least very confident that it's representing a similar situation each time. This is really what the base of what data should be. It's never a single test and this is all that matters. It's looking at trends and changes in trends.
Okay. Yeah, I love that. So the arterial and peripheral elasticity, Elias mentioned that last week as well. Can you get into that a little bit more? Like, can I get a reading on my arterial and peripheral elasticity from the metrics I've gotten from my device? Or do I need a special?
It's a heart health subscription that we're going to be releasing very soon.
Oh, okay.
It's in beta testing right now.
Okay.
Without getting too complex, what we look at here is the PPG waveform. So this here on my wrist is basically just a raw data collector.
Yeah.
Then we send it up to our Pulse engine, which lives inside the cloud. We're the only device that really does cloud processing.
Yeah.
And then what we look at here is the second waveform derivative. So once again, trying to not get too complex, but the actual morphology of the actual waveform itself, it's called volumetric oscillations, right? In between kind of the diastolic and systolic phases, we should see this little dichrotic notch and very specific kind of characteristics of the waveform. And by studying this, we can actually look at basically how much stretchiness, keeping it very simple, are in your arteries. When we're young, we're active, we're healthy, we tend to maintain very flexible, very supple arteries. But as we get older, become more sedentary, have poor lifestyle habits, these arteries tend to harden, right? So this is so predictable that we can actually derive an estimated arterial age out of our biometrics. This, putting everything aside, this is a very meaningful number to people. This really represents health and fitness much more than, say, that little number on the scale. And when you're starting lifestyle modification, this number tends to move relatively quickly as well. So it really gives that little dose of reinforcement to say, I started this daily activity program or modified my nutrition, and I can actually see tangible progress in my arterial age. That's going to keep me motivated and keep me going.
No kidding. So it's mostly exercise and diet that's going to impact arterial age, right? So
and stress is a major one as well.
And stress levels.
Yeah.
Yeah, but stress we can modulate, right? I mean, stress you can. I mean, to me, certainly when I work with my clients, look, we're all dealing with stress, and especially these days, there's no getting around it. I don't care what camp you live in or what you're what you believe or don't believe, you're stressed. But stress we can mitigate through meditation, breath work, that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. And my general motto is, in a world where stress is inevitable, it's how you deal with it, right? And that's why we need that little intervention toolkit and really the experts like you, because it's difficult, right? And when people are doing these types of things to kind of remove any of the kind of perhaps foo-foo-ness around it, you want that objective, quantifiable progress as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Okay, so what would you say, of the metrics that that we collect from our Biostrap? I mean, I'm in there every morning. I'm looking at my HRV, and even one of the things I started doing was I noticed that and I actually interested in that oxygen saturation numbers, because why don't we talk about those, where they should be? Because I'm sometimes seeing, like, I'll have a dip almost every night. And it's usually at the beginning of the night, like I'll have a dip down into the 80s. And then, but for most of the night, usually by the time I get into my sleep, I'm in the high 90s or mid 90s. So what's ideal? And then I'll tell you what I started doing last week, which was an interesting little adventure.
So the kind of clinical standard would be 95 to 99% is considered completely normal. Anything 90 to 95 is generally acceptable, but if that's kind of your baseline, you tend to perhaps have some sort of underlying condition. And then when you drop below 90%, this is more hypoxia, where we generally want to intervene relatively rapidly. So it's going to come down to, once again, there's physiological differences. Not everybody needs to be that 99%. It's about establishing your trend and really assessing for that change in trend. It's generally non-specific, right? We don't know exactly what's going on, but it's that early warning sign where you should at least understand what's going on in your body and try and figure it out.
Right. So, but if it's a single point of that's really low, could that be some kind of an artifact in the data, or is that indicate that there was an event? If it's just like, you know what I mean? Like if it's just one point on a continuous line and the whole line is in a whole other realm, is there any chance that it's an artifact, or is it most likely just there's some kind of something going on?
We have a number of processes in place to minimize things like the motion artifact and kind of false positives, if you will. So we collect this data, we send it up to the cloud for our pulse engine, and that's basically where we do confidence checking. So you may notice at certain points you have gaps in your data, and that's because we weren't confident enough in that data point to send it back to you. Any little dot that shows up in your Biostrap app has been checked 29 different ways.
Really?
So in general, it's going to be precise. Of course, it's not perfect, so it could still be an artifact and limitation our algorithms that are always getting better. But in general, it's going to be true. But once again, a single point is completely normal. And this is where people get very worried about their data as well. It really has to do with a steady change. Decline would be more concerning than a single drop, and then a prolonged, long-term event where you're dropping 85% for an hour during sleep. That's where we start to worry about increased risk of strokes and other diseases as well.
Right. Or if you just hit those lows over and over and over again. Yeah. So I started mouth taping. I started taping my mouth, which of course, my husband is now this poor guy, right? First I'm freezing him out in the bed because I've got one of these bed cooling things on my mattress. Then I've got my sleep crown, which is a pillow I've got over my head. And now I'm putting tape over my mouth. And this poor guy's kind of looking at me going, holy geez, when did I sign up for this?
I love it. I do all the weird stuff too.
Absolutely. So have you found that mouth taping can improve over time people's oxygen, as long as they don't have crazy underlying medical conditions? Obviously, if somebody's got serious sleep disorders that they're dealing with, they have to handle those before you go this far. But for someone who's kind of trying to improve by small degrees, they're already fairly in good shape. Have you seen mouth taping kind of help people's metrics much?
I've really only experimented with it more in the athletic population, and we have seen some quantifiable improvements in things like heart rate recovery. So max effort, how long, 1 to 2 minute heart rate recovery, we've seen some improvements there, which, generally indicates improved cardiovascular function. And then we've seen, some improvements in VO2 max as well, but we were always doing so many different things. It's hard to say what the mouth taping did relative to everything else. I think that's one that probably needs a little bit more research before we'll see it appear in like the clinical field. Like you said, it's a little odd of an intervention, but it makes sense from a physiological perspective. So maybe I'll have to tape my mouth here and see what happens.
Yeah. Well, and if you read there's Patrick McCown's book, The Oxygen Advantage, and he actually talks about keeping your mouth closed while working out, breathing, nasal breathing through workouts and stuff, which becomes a limiting factor for most people. And yet he believes actually improves performance over time if you can muscle through the discomfort of the initial stages.
Yeah. I think the bicarbonate buffering capacity and all that, it makes sense from a physiological perspective. And I think it's so interesting because we learn forever, right? In through the nose, out through the mouth. And even a funny one I read the other day where they always said, you have to keep your hands up on your head and everything and not slouch over when you're trying to recover. And a big study came out and basically disproved that. So all of our coaches lied to us forever.
They were just making it up. Okay. All right. So in your opinion, based on all this, because you've been working with this for so long, and it's so interesting, you've come out of the athletic high performance field into a more clinical world where you're dealing with mere mortals like me and whoever else. What would you say would be the most important metrics people should be focusing on for health? Like, we know it's not weight, right? Pure weight, but what are those metrics and how can people use this technology to kind of track them? Yeah,
I think it does come down to which population we're talking about. But if we're just talking about general health and wellness, more proactive health management, I truly believe the sleep parameters are of the utmost importance. And then probably second would be heart rate variability. And third would be the arterial and peripheral elasticity. When we understand kind of these feedback loops, these tend to be more at the root of everything. Whereas if you see a change in your respiratory rate or your oxygen saturation, very rarely are these alone, right? We would probably see that preceded by a change in your arterial elasticity, for example. So
Mm-hmm.
that's something I actually really love to talk about here is like we're just defining health and fitness completely wrong, right? It's more of this aesthetic
Interesting.
definition. It's big muscles and a thin waistline, and what should it really be, right? And well, maybe not all the way back to a biological perspective, but in general, it's physical health, mental health, stress management, pain and injury prevention, having enough energy to get through your workday, perform well, and then still have energy to play with your kids at the end of it, right? When we start
Yeah.
defining it correctly, we start understanding the metrics we've been using are way far off, right? The scale weights and the twice a year blood pressure in our doctor's office when we're nervous. What we should be doing is tracking things like our heart rate variability and sleep data, and always be doing this little n=1 experimentation, really understanding what works for us and how we optimize at the individual level.
Yeah, I love that. So let's talk about those. So let's talk about HRV, because this is the one that everybody understands, my heart rate should be within, certain ranges. And even then there's wild variability. Like, I mean, for me, my resting heart rate at night's in the 40s. The next person will never get there. They think I'm dead. Like, it just depends. But with heart rate variability, this is one that I think is a bit more mysterious to people. The way I tend to explain it to clients is it's a snapshot of the balance between your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, which give us insight into how recovered you are from the next day, how ready you are for the next day. But what's your explanation, Kevin? I have a feeling it's going to be a little different and maybe a bit more detailed.
Yeah, no, it's a tough one that I'm constantly learning about. I think the
Yeah.
research is very great, what we do know about it today, but I think it's one of these kind of untapped things that we're going to continue to evolve and learn more about. But in general, we used to look at these EKGs and think that your heartbeats are supposed to fall very consistently. And when you're looking at the
Yep.
bird's eye view, they absolutely should. But when you zoom in at the level of milliseconds, we should see this constant game of tug of war going on between your sympathetic and your parasympathetic, right? Every time you breathe in, heart rate should speed up just a little bit. When you breathe out, it should slow down. Once again, quantifying this game of tug of war. This is extremely important because this balance is controlling all these involuntary processes, right? The more obvious ones, respiratory rate, heart rate, kind of going on in the background without us thinking about it. But very important, stress hormones, inflammatory processes, immune system, right? So it controls essentially everything that we don't really have immediate control over, or sometimes we can modulate them through, mindfulness and things like that. But in general, most of our life running in the background. And so this is one number that allows you to quantify all of these processes. But then it comes down to, well, what's a good number, right? And this is where I like to get completely away from any type of classification for that. There does exist ranges, right? We know what a good range is and a bad range is. But in general, it should be something that we look at the individual level. I've seen very high performing athletes with a relatively low heart rate variability and people with a number of comorbidities with a high heart rate variability. If we were crude, we would look at that and say, this person's healthier, right? With a higher heart rate variability, it doesn't work like that. Once again, it's all about establishing your trend over time and then looking at good and bad changes. People have, once again, this idea that heart rate variability should skyrocket. That's actually very bad as well. In general, and things that we're learning how to utilize better in things like our recovery score, we want very little day-to-day change, what we call covariance, because this is stress resilience, right? That the first time you
Right.
go exercise in a long time, you're going to see a huge dip in your heart rate variability. As you get more fit, we should see a lower dip and a lower dip until basically you're relatively steady over time. So
Right.
day-to-day change should be as low as possible. What we call covariance, we want less than 10% day-to-day change. But over the long run, when we're cleaning up our gut and we're meditating and we're sleeping better, we do want to see a steady uphill climb as well. So it's one of these numbers that is intrinsically meant to move very slow, but we want it to increase over time. So that's where it gets very confusing for people because it's not necessarily good to increase. It's generally bad to decrease, but it gets much more complex than that. And that's when we're talking about one form of heart rate variability. There's nonlinear methods and there's frequency methods and more things than we probably want to talk about today.
Probably, yeah. So for me, for example, just to bring a real life example to our discussion, my average heart rate variability overnight will quite often be in the 60s or 70s, which I've taken to be a positive sign because my general benchmark for people is you want to try to be a little over, at least a bit over your age or at your age, and that's a completely unscientific benchmark, but Just, I don't think there's one single study out there that would support that position. But when I do my meditation and I get my Biostrap to measure my biometrics during my meditation, which is another time I use the Biostrap is for meditation.
Mm-hmm.
Now my heart rate variability will go to 163 or 150. Like it'll go way high. And does that make sense to you that like my nighttime average heart rate variability, which will go in the hundreds sometimes, it'll dip quite low at other times, but the average seems to come in, kind of 60s or 70s, let's say. But then when I go to meditate, then I'm going to see a real bump in my HRV during that, 20-minute time period. That make, I talk about it almost as your heart rate becoming floppy, like it's relaxed, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, you're taking control of that autonomic process. So that's exactly what we should see. And kind of back to the point why when we trend data, we need to focus on the nocturnal, right? So if we were to build that into the data set, we would have no idea what your normal heart rate variability would be. So you should be able to modulate it. Deep breathing techniques will absolutely skyrocket your heart rate variability, just like applying a high dose of stress. Like go run one lap around a track as fast as you can. Your heart rate variability is going to be near zero,
yeah.
Right? So you're momentarily affecting your heart rate variability for the greater goal of improving it over time. So that makes a lot of sense. And frankly, you're a very impressive meditator if you're getting it that high. I'm still working on it.
You know what? I call it a meditation practice. Right? I think the word practice is probably more important than meditation in that sentence, because there's days when I do really well, and then there's days where I just, like I feel sometimes like if you're on days when you're more worked up, it's like 20 minutes to ruminate, and it's an opportunity to kind of try and break that cycle, right? So
absolutely. Yeah, it's something I do every day, usually more in the range of about 5 minutes. I have a newborn baby at home, so squeezing that time in can be difficult, but I do know it's so good for me. And what I'm really trying to do actually is kind of refine that little Zen score that you see at the end of it. I'm not sure if that's something you've seen, but we do our best to actually score your meditation. I may need to turn that Meditation Plus on for you, because you get a list of tracks and everything as well. So you should get a little Zen score at the end, and we're trying to score a 0 to 100 on basically how well you meditated. And right now, it's something we need to improve upon. It's just one of these fields that's a lot of research needs to happen. We're looking at, in general, did your heart rate decrease? Did your heart rate variability increase? Did you maintain a relatively consistent respiratory rate? Did you minimize your movement? We're scoring these things to try and quantify, help people understand how their meditation practice is improving their meditation. So
I see. Okay, yeah, I got 100 this morning. Is that good? What's the scale?
0 to 100, 100 being the best. So
oh, look at me.
Excellent. I'm like 30.
Yesterday I was only 75. And it's interesting, because for me, even like I got the Meditation Plus extension, and one of my challenges, and I think it's my cosmic challenge, is that I can't always get the music to work, which can really mess up your meditation as you're sitting there being all ticked off that the music's not working. But I think what'll be interesting this just hit me now. Like I thought I had a really good meditation yesterday, but yesterday the music did work, and my Zen score is actually 75. And it'll be interesting to see over time, is there a difference between my Zen score when there is music versus when I'm meditating in silence? Because in a way, the music is external stimulation of some kind.
Yeah, it probably comes down to some people will respond better to the music, and some people won't, right? And some people are going to respond extremely well to binaural beats, and we don't see that across the board in everybody. So once again, that's why it's so important. Physiology is complex. You can listen to people like us all day, and we apply, interventions with data-driven confidence. We're super confident. We believe we have the right package, but then it doesn't work. And that's because humans are unique, and the best way to do it is to apply something, monitor the outcome, see if it's working, and if it's not, switch it up.
Love it. Yeah, no, that's exact. And it's interesting because the whole N of one philosophy, which is it's very powerful when you take it right. And some people, certainly people in the conventional world will poo-poo it, right? And I think it's so important to be flexible enough to look at the big data set and say, okay, we know in general that this, and this is going to be a positive on HRV for most people. When you are able to take it down to just yourself, and now say, okay, well, most people calm down with music and most people do better with this. And for me, it's the reverse. And allowing people the freedom of discovering and acknowledging this for themselves, I think, is really where the power of that N of one comes in.
Absolutely. And we understand why there's these kind of arbitrary binning of, your heart rate 60 to 100 and why we need kind of generic approaches and everything. And that's because we didn't have things like wearable technology. The ability, the resources required to do this, pre-wearables was impossible. Now we have these little data collection tools, some arguably better than others on a large majority of the population. And these types of N equals one should be a little bit more mainstream. And I think it's moving that way. Particularly, I think COVID has really accelerated that because it's contactless and it's, generally pretty reliable. So I think hopefully we'll see that revolution here pretty soon.
Yeah. No, and it's interesting. And there's one wearable in particular that's tried to kind of, I don't know that it's formal, but they've tried to encourage their users to track their metrics, to see certain metrics like body temperature and heart rate. And they're doing it with a university, like some kind of a COVID study, I think. And I think they're not saying you can tell if you have COVID, but what they're saying, they're asking the question, could we, looking back, like kind of reverse engineer, are there signs that might indicate that? But I don't know that you would ever be able to say, oh, this person has COVID. It would be more like this person's coming down with something, right? So
absolutely.
For people listening, like if, let's say, you were coming down with a cold, a flu, like whatever it is, what might you see? Like, how much of a temperature increase do we know? Actually, here's a better question for you. Do we know what increase in temperature would be relevant? Because sometimes I'll have a 0.1, 0.2, 0.3. Is it over several nights? Or because before you have a fever, is there a small consistent fluctuation in temperature that might be indicative, or heart rate? Definitely HRV would go down.
Yeah, that's something we're heavily invested in Biostrap as well. We're doing a lot of COVID research right now with universities all across the world. And so we're, talking a little bit before the publications and stuff, but I'm happy to share this information. Number one is the temperature screening is actually proven to be almost useless. It's kind of a what I like to call false sense of security. Like, I get why they're doing it. Anytime you go into a restaurant, they're doing your forehead scan right now. When you really look at the literature, one of the largest publications of COVID positive individuals, less than 50% of them admitted to the ICU presented with a temperature above 98.4. More than 50% had a lower temperature than normal, right? So higher isn't necessarily worse. In this case, people who presented with a lower temperature actually had worse clinical outcomes.
And could you say that that's because their immune system may not have been responding appropriately? Because we know that an elevated temperature is an appropriate immune response to fighting a pathogen, right?
Correct.
So in those people, that's interesting that they had a worse outcome. Could it be that these people, and I'm sure somebody else will dig through the data and try to find similarities in these people to see what it is, but if a drop in temperature is almost like an immune system that's not able to rise to the challenge, as it were.
Absolutely. Yeah, probably full on, adrenal fatigue, autonomic burnout. We don't know. I'm kind of speaking out of turn here. I like to follow the science, but I just found that to be extremely interesting. In terms of the biometrics, we do absolutely expect to change. In our research, we've shown just nearly everybody's going to see an increase in their respiratory rate, a relative decrease in their oxygen saturation, but population by population, the healthy individuals have a lower and less pronounced drop, whereas the less healthy individuals have a more pronounced drop, an increase in heart rate. And then every single individual that's classified as COVID in our studies has had a pronounced change in their arterial elasticity. And this is a little bit of a curveball. There's the Brady-Kinnon hypothesis, which kind of shows that this is a little bit more of a circulatory disorder, and our arteries tend to get a little leaky. And this came out well after my hypothesis in the study. I thought, in general, arterial elasticity would decrease, right? You would assume it's not going to improve your arterial health.
It gets stiffer.
Yeah, but it was actually the opposite. We saw a huge increase in your arterial elasticity. Once again, nothing should change that quickly overnight. So that raised some red flags for us. And we went back, and every single individual that's been diagnosed with COVID and provided their official diagnosis paperwork and everything to us, every single one of them has had a change in their arterial elasticity. And this tended to precede any of their symptoms, but also any of their other changes in biometrics. It preceded their change in their respiratory rate and their oxygen saturation. So this is something we're taking very seriously. One, because it's, going to be a little bit more specific. Like, as you know, your heart rate variability can drop, and we don't know if you have a respiratory illness. You could be extremely stressed. This is a little bit more of a biometric signature that could be a little bit, improve the specificity of these algorithms.
Wow.
You nailed it. Absolutely never are we going to be able to say you have COVID from a wearable. I think people are crazy if they think it's ever going to get there. What we can say is you're showing signs of respiratory illness. We don't know if it's the flu, if it's COVID, or perhaps you had a crazy weekend and you drank way too much alcohol. These will have similar effects on your respiratory rate and such. Once again, it's that early warning sign. We're trying to inform people of change in health as early as possible. That's our best opportunity for intervention.
Love it. That's incredible. Okay, so then on a day-by-day basis, so I'm looking at my data in the morning. If you were advising someone, what would you tell them to, okay, look for this, this, and this, and if you see these certain things, here's what you should or shouldn't do. So, the most obvious one I think is HRV. If compared to your baseline, your HRV's taken a real dip one night, we might have that person conduct themselves differently that day. Do you want to get into that a little bit? And are there any other biometrics we would advise people to change their behavior on?
Yeah, absolutely. When we're working with the end consumer, that's really why we have these three fancy summary scores at the top, right? So activity score, recovery score, sleep score, all 0 to 100. Everybody understands that a 70 is better than a 60, right?
Yeah.
The curveball there is things like your sleep score. They're more absolute algorithms, meaning we know what good sleep is and how to attain it essentially, whereas the recovery score is completely relative. We're not comparing you to anybody except yourself. So your recovery score is a function of your biometrics today relative to your own biometrics over the previous 30 days. So I really find that to be the best, the recovery score in terms of if I'm making a lifestyle modification, I'm starting a new diet, or I was very stressed at work the other day, that's the number that's going to really show more of the acute change. The sleep score is absolute, if you're improving that score over time, you're sleeping better. That's great. So, but what I like to do is look at the recovery score. If it's, below a 70, investigate it a little bit. If it's below a 50, this means you are very bad for today, right? So you should dive in and look at, well, which biometrics are affecting that algorithm. That's something I really appreciate about Biostrap as well. I think a lot of people are extremely secretive about their algorithms, like all the IP protection type stuff. We give you the insight. You're going to go in and you're going to see exactly how these factors are factoring into our algorithm. You'll see, wow, my HRV, I got a 0% on that today. That would mean you have the worst heart rate variability today than you've had over the last 30 days. So you see that, and then you go back to the drawing board and you say, what did I do yesterday that was different? Right? Was I stressed? Did I have a meal? Maybe I had a generally healthy meal, but my gut didn't tolerate it very well. Now you can get to the bottom of perhaps some unknown food sensitivity, right? A generally healthy food can be bad for you if you don't know what's going on. Like, oddly, curveball, I have a weird reaction to asparagus, right? Extremely healthy food, but every time I have asparagus, my heart rate variability drops. So N equals 1, I know I probably, without going to do a blood test, probably have some sort of intolerance there. So that's something, honestly, I want to improve a lot in our companies. Some of our competitors are doing really well. Like, we all share a mission. I like to talk highly of them sometimes. Like Whoop is absolutely killing it with their journals, right? You go in and you put in consumed alcohol, and over perhaps 5 episodes of consuming alcohol, they say predictability. If you consume alcohol, your heart rate variability will drop 7%. Like, this is awesome because you're really making meaningful sense of behaviors. These are all things that we plan to do, just, being pulled in a million directions.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that was my one comment last week was, and because I've been doing this for a long time, being able to add those tags, because there's so much information here, being able to add, because my interesting that you mentioned my HRV contribution to my recovery score was 3% last night. So clearly it sucked. Right? Meanwhile, my sleep score is in the 90s. So I slept really well, but my recovery relative to, the last however many days I've been monitoring myself was really not great. So So now I'm sitting here scratching my head trying to remember, what did I do? What did I, so I think I would imagine even a late meal would have would have a negative effect on this as well, which I didn't have personally last night, but.
Yeah, late meals, particularly high sugar meals right before bed, tend to really disrupt a lot of the autonomic processes and such. So
And then the other thing is, I think that people, that's important for people to understand is that a poor recovery score one day could be that you just, you had one of those killer workouts yesterday, you left it all on the mat, and this is a sign, okay, today's a recovery day, dude. Like, this is not, you don't want to do those days necessarily back to back. And some people recover faster than others. And I think that's another one of these metrics that people will often brush off, and yet if you use it properly, you can make more progress, if you will, than if you push through, because many people have this muscle through mentality, just tough it out.
yeah, no, this is the uphill battle with all the athletes that I work with. It's always, work harder, get more gains, and that's just not the science, right? What people need to understand, general population and elite athletes, is there's a stressor phase and then there's an adaptation phase. Whatever you're doing in the gym or studying for that test tomorrow or whatever it may be, this represents the stressor and it's absolutely necessary. You have to do it. But all of the adaptation, the muscle gain, and the improved memory and all this stuff, it happens when you're sleeping and when you're recovering. So that's really what this little recovery score is meant to be: is your readiness to perform physically and mentally while preventing injuries. So when your recovery score is rather low for the day, it means, yeah, you can go out and exercise, but understand you're at a higher risk of injury and you're at a lower ability to make any type of gain anyways. You'd be better to do some sort of recovery, and that's where it becomes another curveball. We're not saying take the day off. When you're not doing that, you should be doing passive or active recovery, meditation and cold therapy and all of these different things, because if you just sit there, yeah, it'll recover and you'll get back to a high recovery score in a few days. But if you take charge and you actively recover, you meditate, you're gonna be in a much better place tomorrow to go make an adaptation again.
Right. So the active recovery is almost a way of assimilating the gains and helping your body to run through the processes of, like, actively recovering, as opposed to just sitting and watching TV for the day.
Yeah, and with the general population, when you first start lifestyle modification, that recovery score will tank, right? And so that doesn't mean you should go take a few days off. Once again, you should be ready, actively encouraging your nervous system to be prepared the following day. Very rarely should we tell people to take days off. They should be actively engaging.
Okay. Well, this is awesome. I'm learning a lot here. So I think we've covered really what are the daily elements that will ultimately affect your biometrics and sleep patterns. And we could do a quick summary now, but do you want to, in terms of affecting those recovery and sleep patterns, I think everybody kind of understands, like, a very high stress day, or doing too much physical activity, eating a meal too late kind of thing, going on a bender. Is there anything else in there that we've missed that people might not know would affect their sleep or their recovery score for the next day?
I generally like to talk about the low hanging fruit, the no cost interventions that really move the needle, and I've really found, in plenty of research to support it, is circadian interventions. It's so meaningful to just get people to go to sleep and wake up at nearly the same time every day. Of course, a little leniency in there, but the pre-sleep routine, avoiding the blue light, all of this is extremely meaningful. But really, this normalcy in your circadian pattern. This is something I've developed an algorithm around. I'm not sure if you're 15 days into your Biostrap use yet, but with the sleep lab feature, after 15 days minimum, sometimes a little bit longer, we study your sleep patterns, and we're able to tell you the ideal sleep onset and wake up time. And then we do sleep accounting thereafter. So within 5 hours prior to bed, you start getting alerts on your dashboard, and you get basically a little timer, a little countdown to remind you to start winding down and do your pre-sleep routine. Then we score your circadian rhythm. How well did you actually adhere to the recommendation that we had? And you'd be amazed, just by getting people to sleep and wake up at the same time. There's tons of research around, like cortisol levels and all of these types of things, and largely a lot of blood sugar, like HbA1cs and such. But when you just start talking anecdotally about cognitive function and waking up feeling refreshed and energy levels, this tends to be a very meaningful, cost-free intervention that I like to encourage with everybody.
Oh, that's true. So that's interesting. So I didn't do this. I guess it's an add-on, right? for sleep lab?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and add that for you right after this
Okay.
so you can test it out.
That's really interesting because I always thought, oh, that sleep lab's going to be really about snoring. I automatically assumed that, and I didn't get that that's really interesting because to your point, yes, respecting that circadian rhythm. But what would be really interesting is to see the effect of it over time. Again, for people to witness, if, make a commitment for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, I'm going to be religious about my circadian and see respecting that circadian cycle and see what the impacts are on all the other metrics. That would be really interesting.
Yeah, that's a monthly scorecard that we recently put out. So you'll really need 2 months of data to make that meaningful. But yeah, you'll get your average circadian score and then kind of, see the changes in your biometrics associated. So if we're less adherent in general, you'll see these biometrics decrease. That usually comes on the first or second day of each month. So you should be getting one here pretty soon.
Ooh, report card. I'm interested. I'm keen about that. Okay. So I'm going to ask you a question that I'm sure people ask you all the time because people are always looking for shortcuts. And I don't know if you get into this stuff at all with your clients, so if you don't, or the people that you work with, but do people ever ask you, so, okay, like, let's say I want to push the envelope. Is there a supplement I can take that will mitigate the effect of ABC? So, because people are looking for shortcuts, right? They want to have their cake and eat it too. So things like, for example, we tell people, look, don't work out late at night, because if you work out too late, it's going to spike your cortisol and it's going to make it very hard for your body to recover, to sleep. And then you get people coming in, yes, but you can take phosphatidylserine, or you can take ashwagandha, or you can take magnesium. What are your thoughts on these kinds of interventions and how, again, we can track them. We have our Biostrap, we can check it out, but do you have any thoughts on that in terms of shortcuts to mitigating bad behaviors, or not bad, but let's say suboptimal behaviors?
Not really. I'm a nutrition guy. I believe in micronutrient density. So if you're really doing everything you're supposed to be doing throughout the day, which is extremely tough, and that's where supplementation needs to fill some gaps. But if you're eating 8 to 10 servings of vegetables and fruits every day of all different colors and getting your full phytonutrient spectrum, you're covering a lot of those bases that we've really evolved to need, right? In general, it comes down once again to a case-by-case basis and what the goals of a program are. One that I would recommend if somebody's trying to build muscle is something like a Generation UCAN Super Starch. It's this amazing kind of thing that, it's not going to spike your blood sugar, but replaces a lot of that muscle glycogen. And if you don't want to lose muscle and you're perhaps doing more endurance racing, or your goal is to increase muscle, things like that are absolutely, miraculous that they, scientists were able to create things like that. So there's a time and a need. And in general, I like to start off with supplementation early in a program, kind of give your body a little crutch to get back to where it needs to be. And this is maybe an unpopular opinion in a lot of these kind of biohacking groups, but I believe you get your body to a level and it's going to do what it was meant to do when you treat it right. And that's largely through nutrition and everything. So I'm not a huge supplementation guy myself, but once again, time and a place. And then IVs and things are excellent as well, but that's not going to be readily available to everybody.
No. Although again, once you get your journal feature up, like, it'll be interesting for people to be able to log, oh, today I did Myers cocktail or an NAD IV, or frankly, I used to tell people sometimes who had blood sugar issues overnight, I would have them try half a serving of Genucan before bed. And it just seemed to hold that blood sugar steady and give them that little tiny thread of energy that they needed for their brain overnight, and seemed to help their sleep. So all these little tips and tricks that we can use, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I'm speaking solely gen population when I say generally don't recommend it, and diseases and things like that. It's a totally different story.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's close with the big question.
All right.
All right. Kevin's just sitting there waiting for it. So what would you say are the most interesting findings and breakthroughs with data that you've come across? Like, in your career, what are the biggest aha moments that you've had in terms of data and these, like, just in this whole field? Like, what's the thing that you think's been the biggest game changer?
I think probably one of the life-altering, trajectory-changing research studies of my life was one. I was originally in school. I was planning on being a psychiatrist, and a big research study came out about essentially treating our gut through probiotics and micronutrients and everything, seeing better clinical outcomes with mood disorders than what we'd ever seen with things like psychotropic medications. This was a huge turning point in my life where it's like, man, we're doing things wrong, and there's a better way, and we know it now. And so I actually, at that point, left medical school and started a metabolic testing company. So I was trying to make my little dent on the world. So that was one that really just a aha moment for me, where I was like, there's a better way, and I want to be on this side of it, not this side of it. And no disrespect to anybody out there, but that's what my philosophy. If it can be done naturally, we absolutely should be. So that's kind of one of the more interesting research studies. Another great one that I came across a few years ago was a great study around VO2 max testing. I'm sure people have a general understanding of VO2 max, how much oxygen you can consume during a graded exercise test. This has always been an athletic biomarker. Higher is better. You probably have better endurance capacity. This study showed that it was actually among the best predictors of cardiovascular disease, neurodegeneration, and immune function. So this is another one that just validates, our work, exercise, nutrition, all of this is prevention. Your VO2 max was actually a better predictor of cardiovascular disease than your family history and high blood pressure and all of these different things. Your VO2 max, right? Something that's very modifiable. So just kind of reinforce what I'm doing here, living on the proactive side, right? We understand, 80% of conditions are preventable through lifestyle modification. Why are we still saying eat healthy and exercise and sending people to Google for information? We need to do better, and that's kind of the loop I'm trying to close. It's really on the preventable side of things. And then I guess one of the more interesting recent on the Biostrap side is probably the arterial elasticity studies in COVID. There's this kind of
that's a mind bender, that one. That's incredible.
It's essentially a new biomarker that nobody's really heard of. It's validated in some papers and everything, but it's not mainstream whatsoever. And for that to be the earliest sign of perhaps respiratory illness and maybe other conditions as well, it's something that I think we as clinicians should really start paying attention to. And the ability to measure that longitudinally over time in all of our patients. I mean, maybe we'll discover it's a better predictor of atherosclerosis than perhaps, blood pressure testing and things like that. I think there's a lot of potential behind it that's yet to be discovered. So just like at a scientific level, my curiosity around what this biomarker may be able to measure is kind of untapped right now. I think there's so much we can do with it.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting. I mean, that is interesting, really. And even just from a day-to-day basis, the fact that a wearable device can give you a sense of the elasticity of your blood vessels is pretty mind-blowing if you think about it, right? It's pretty amazing stuff.
I like to think so.
I think it's very cool. All right. Well, Kevin, this has been fantastic. Is there anything else you think we left out that we should be sharing with the listeners today about Biostrap or how to use it? I mean, people can now go to biostrap.com. I know that as recently as 2 weeks ago, there were, you guys were out of stock because I guess you sold a big bunch over the holidays, but it's back in stock. I think one thing maybe that's important for people to understand, and you might want to highlight this before we go, is really coming back to the point that the Biostrap itself is really intended as a nighttime metric measurement device. And you're offering this whole suite of devices really to kind of so that each one gets to shine in its zone of genius. So the heart rate monitor that people can wear on their arm or on their chest, there's two different ones, I guess.
Yeah. It's essentially the data that you value based on your goal or your population, right? And some people monitoring caloric expenditure during exercise can be extremely important. And for that, we do need active heart rate. So we have an additional sensor where you can wear it on your, like you said, kind of forearm to mid bicep or around your chest, more of a traditional heart rate monitor. And then we're going to get very precise kind of active heart rate variability, and then we're going to be able to gauge your active caloric expenditure. In other populations, like a cardiovascular outpatient, things like step counting is extremely important, physical activity. Right, every wearable, just to be honest, we do it too when you're only wearing this, we're estimating your steps based on how much your arms are swaying. We can all probably relate to washing dishes and we got 1,000 steps for it. Or if you look at somebody perhaps with a walker, they're going to get 0 steps because they're not swaying their arms. So by putting this little gyroscope accelerometer on your foot, around your ankle or in your shoelaces, we're measuring every single step, ground contact forces. So once again, it comes down to, well, not everyone wants to wear a bunch of sensors. We do get that. But when data integrity really matters, there's a need for multiple sensors. And that's why we have kind of a configure your own set. What's your goal? What sensors do you need to accomplish that goal? And then, we kind of do a lot of the legwork on what to do with all that data as well.
Okay. I love it. That's amazing. I think that alone is really important information for all of us to kind of get is, do one thing, do it really well, and then get something else to do the next thing. So anyway, well, Kevin, thank you so much. I've learned a ton today. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me and to talk to the audience as a result. So biostrap.com, do you interface with the public at all, or do you like to kind of hang out in the background?
Oh, I love talking to people. So we're launching a little bit more content here pretty soon that you guys will see a little bit more of me. If I can just add that one little thing here real quick at the end, we're launching what we're calling Biostrap Academy relatively soon. This is really our effort to educate a population, and that's not an easy task to do. Once again, we're trying to say this little number called heart rate variability is more important than your scale weight. With this comes a huge need to educate people on what these biometrics are, how to interpret them, how to understand what a good trend versus a bad trend is. This is something we're trying to accomplish. A lot of legwork and working with the right professionals to accomplish it. I think that's really the missing link. I think a lot of people are wearing these little guys, not just Biostraps, but Fitbits and everything as well. And they're getting data and they have no idea what it means and what to do with it. And that's once again a loop that we're trying to tackle with a lot of partners as well.
That's amazing. So Biostrap Academy, so is that going to be basically for any Biostrap user, and that'll be a way for them to just become more educated about how to get the most out of their device, basically?
Yeah. Everything from basic onboarding, which devices measure what, to how to navigate your app, because it's a little complex, right? To really diving into the biometrics.
Love it.
There's a portion that'll be available to everybody, right? Anyone that's measuring their heart rate in their sleep is going to benefit from this. But when we get into more Biostrap specific, like arterial elasticity, that'll be for Biostrap members only, and frankly, because you need a Biostrap to measure it. So.
Oh, I'm looking forward to that. That's amazing. And so when do you think the Biostrap Academy will be out?
It's going to be kind of a slow drip. I believe within the next few days, we're going to put out our first series of videos, more like meet the experts type of thing. So before I start telling people what all these numbers are, I got to, establish some credibility and everything with our audience first. But then it's going to be a slow drip, and it's a lot of work, as you could imagine, but that's something we're ready to tackle as a company. So
I love it. That's amazing. Well, Kevin, thank you so much. This has been great. And I think we're all looking forward to heading over to Biostrap Academy and learn more about our devices and all the magical information it can give us.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for having me. This was a lot of fun.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for joining me on this episode of the Biohacking Superhuman Performance Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please remember to leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, because that's what helps us to be heard and to be seen. If you'd like to connect with me directly, or if you'd like to leave any comments, or if you have any questions about this episode, please reach out to me directly through my website, natnidham.com. And of course, if you're not already a member of the Biohacking Superhuman Performance community on Facebook, that's where you'll find me every day. It's a short application. Just answer a couple of questions and you're in and interfacing with other amazing biohackers. Thanks again, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode.